What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and my good friend Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, brother?
Chilling, man. Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. We're doing a rare Sunday podcast.
Yeah.
Or Sunday afternoon. Right during football Sunday. But you know what? This is more important. This is the only time I had time. So we have to make sacrifices. And it brings me to the schedule for at least the next month or so. So you've probably noticed that we've been releasing episodes every other weekend. Not every other weekend, every other week, excuse me. And the reason why is mainly because of just life events that are happening in both of our lives. I think we're going to continue with that schedule until, Danny, you get back from Europe, right? You're going to Europe in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's what, November?
That's correct. So it just kind of gives us a little bit of time to focus on good content without like rushing through it. Because the weeks that we ended up not releasing something is because we weren't fully baked for an episode. And rather than put out bad content, we'd rather just do it less frequently.
What we're saying is that, we're traveling and stuff in the way. We're not going to degrade the content. So we're going to do every other week for now with the goal of getting back to the weekly schedule again, really.
Right.
That's ultimately the goal, is to, get all these priority things done and then focus on getting the schedule back to where it was. But for now, we're still going to do our best to deliver content consistently. So just wanted to address that because we do often get people who are be like, "Where's my episode? Where's the episode? Where's the episode? Where's the last episode?" I'm like, dude,
chill,
relax, just chill. Listen to the back catalog, maybe.
Right, we have hundreds of episodes that I'm sure you probably didn't listen to.
There's hundreds. Where's the episode, man? You guys don't love it anymore, man. You guys used to do every single week, and now you guys
used to do 3 times a week. How come you don't do that anymore?
Yeah, where's your love, man? You guys sold out.
Do you remember when we were doing like 3x a week? Man, those episodes were weird.
Yeah, I mean, well, because we were doing more current events, and we're not doing as much content on current events. Maybe we will do more of that in the future, but honestly, the reason why is because I haven't been really, reading the New York Times like I used to from start to finish. So I just don't have I'd rather just focus on doing history, and I think you would too for now. But regardless, everyone's bored of this conversation. Why don't we get into the actual episode
good.
Before we're promising better content, and we're leading off with minutes
shitty
of
content
talking about our schedule and our personal lives, which no one really cares about at the end of the day. They care about, the actual content they digest. And
so
we are continuing the overall theme of 20th century politics and 20th century warfare, World War I, World War II, and the Russian Revolution. And, with content like this, or with topics like this, you just kind of fly everywhere. Right. So last episode, we covered really the rise of, or the early origins of, the Bolshevik movement with Lenin. And now we're jumping to the Eastern Front. We're going to be talking about really the Japanese, really what kind of, what are the origins of World War II in the East, really? Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Danny, how do you want to start this off?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we've been talking, over the last really several months about the different angles, of things that contributed to the origins of World War II by looking at like the various different interwar periods of the European nations. And a couple of examples, we looked at how the aftermath of World War I shaped the Weimar Republic in Germany. We dove into, how the Treaty of Paris redrew the borders of Europe and giving rise to new countries like modern Poland, who we went into depth on. We spent several episodes on the Russian Revolution, both like the origins of that and also the rise of Marxism, which was the last episode, and how that shaped the Russian domestic and foreign policy. and we covered these in so many other different types of angles, but we really haven't spent any time covering the other half of the world, like the Eastern one. So, and there are just so many angles that we can possibly cover about the Eastern theater. But I think in particular, I thought we might spend maybe a couple episodes covering Japan, because they're basically the central axis point around which a lot of the events leading up to World War II revolve. And in doing some research on Japan during that interwar period, I find myself like kind of diving back into the relevant history, like before and through World War I, to like remind myself really of the conditions that put Japan in the position that it was in, between both of those world wars. So what I thought would be cool today would be to lay some groundwork and do a bit of a refresher on that backstory. Now, we've covered pretty much all of these topics either in their own episodes or, in part of other episodes over the past several years. But I think doing one quick overview on those today will really make talking about Japan in the interwar period a lot easier in future episodes. And plus, I realized that there were a few topics that we really didn't go into any great detail about that I think, now's a good opportunity to talk about. Sound like a good plan?
That sounds like a good plan too. And I mean, to some degree, this follows up on the last episode we did about really, how should I say, the shocks to the system in the Russian Empire that kind of spelled out the beginning of
shocks.
the end. Yeah, and really one of the major shocks to the Russian, for the Russian Revolution that really contributed to, that kind of blew a lot of, or fanned the flames of revolution, where it was the foreign policy of Tsar Nicholas II and his cabinet in the East, because essentially what happens is that leads to really a foreign policy disaster. In Japan, losing a war with Japan or against Japan, which it kind of is like the first strike, and then the second strike comes in World War I.
Right.
But we'll cover that today. So why don't we start off? What point of time do you want to start this off in?
As a side note, I went through all of our different notes and episodes on Japan, and I was thinking about going as far back as like the ancient origins of Japan and talking about like the the ancient peoples there, and I was like, nah, I'm biting off way too much. But I think a reasonable starting point to kick off some of this backstory is probably talking about the Perry expedition and gunboat diplomacy.
So I'm tempted to do, because I told you before, I recently played a video game called Sekiro.
Yeah.
which takes place in Warring States, Japan. So it's in Sengoku, Japan, which is like 1400s to the 1600s, until Tokugawa centralizes everything and kind of makes it a unified state for 200 years, or really for its preceding future. But it's interesting. It's a really interesting time. It's the time of where the samurai exist in popular culture, or like the ninja exist in popular culture, and it's like
it's a very romanticized period.
Yeah, and it's kind of regurgitated now, or not regurgitated, but like it's mythologized a lot. Where like there was a lot of histories going on, and I guess this plays into like the current rise of like the Japanese identity on the national stage, where a lot of that is kind of trying to think of like a good politically correct way to say it without infuriating weebs, because how weebs are.
Oh yeah.
A lot of the stuff about Bushido Code was like, really romanticized in like the 19th century, early 20th century, to say, like the Bushido Code book that was first written in English. That's a lot of what where that comes from. Like there wasn't really like a samurai code. Like that stuff is all kind of bullshit. Like there was no such thing as the ninja in like the black clad suit. That stuff, like the black, like the black hooded, jumpsuit or whatever, the beekeeper outfit. They, that stuff was all just in plays. Like that's how they portrayed the ninja in like the kabuki theater plays.
Right.
So a lot of that history is, mythologized and romanticized. At the end of the day, it was just kind of like a warring state, tribal clans killing each other. There wasn't that much to be romanticized about it, but
nevertheless, there's so much popular culture around it that it's hard to not talk about it.
And it's so interesting too. It's,
yeah,
the real history is always, the history is always romanticized into some kind of like fairy tale. But then when you get to the real, like when you start looking at the real history, it's even way more interesting than like the romanticized version of it. Because then you get like the real human aspect and
the real gritty, just fucking Game of Thronesy type, stories about the people that vie for power and the fucked up things that they do to get it. Yeah.
But there's actually a pretty good Netflix documentary, but I digress.
Yeah. We could actually start maybe a little bit earlier than the Perry expedition. Maybe we can go with like the Tokugawa shogunate, which is, this is in the 1600s. The Tokugawa clan emerges as that power player after that long warring states period in the Sengoku period. And essentially, Edo Japan was like a pseudo-unified, pre-modern feudal state at this time where the military class across the country submitted to the Tokugawa shogun. And the shogun promoted the Confucianism as the official political doctrine, mainly because Confucian ideology emphasized like a hierarchy, right? And they were really all about, a very defined class system. So in 1644, the Ming Dynasty in China falls apart. And in order to, identify this like a moral cause of why did the Ming, fall, these Japanese Confucian scholars, they engaged with like looking at classical Confucian texts to, to give some advice on the new Tokugawa shogunate, on how not to fucking fall from grace like the Ming Dynasty did. And what their argument was that Japan in antiquity was perfect at one point, and it was like this utopia, like, kind of like a lot of the, this isn't anything new. Like you're going to see this in history all the time where people will fetishize or like romanticize the past, and it was always greater in the past. I mean, the whole MAGA movement is basically like that, in a nutshell, but that's a contemporary example, but you'll see this across lots of different histories.
We're talking about, we're more so talking about though, like, because, current right-wing politics in America, it's such a current, like your grandfathers lived in that time, like your grandparents lived in that time.
But they were talking about like hundreds of years before
your parents were born. We're talking about when you're romanticizing a period of time that's so hazy, it's so far back that the people really don't have that much of a connection to it anymore.
Exactly.
And
so it's like
you're
it's like
kind
trumped
of
up
making
to a
a connection.
Exactly.
Because we still have a connection to America in the 1950s to some degree.
Right. We have documentation.
Yeah, you have documentations. Your parents or grandparents lived in it. Your firsthand accounts. Like we're very much in the same era. What we're talking about, we're just talking about now, like a reduction in living standards between some groups and things like that. And that, but I don't want to get into that today. But what we're talking about is looking at your past, and basically what happens is that you're looking, okay, let's look at this period of time. So this is, in this case in Japan, it's 700. Right? It's 600, 700 AD Japan, right? The classical period.
Right. And that's the period that they were talking about in 1600 that was apparently perfect.
Yeah. So they're looking back, and, these historians don't know everything about these. There's obviously text and there's things that survived. Like these weren't Neanderthals. Like this was actually an advanced civilization in Japan in the 600s and 700s. It was probably more advanced of a civilization than Japan in like the 900s and the 9th century to the later on centuries. But it was, when you're looking at that far back, then you of course have to fill in gaps, and the gaps that you're using or what you're filling in those gaps are things that are usually politically convenient. or
Yeah.
they're meant to, for something politically.
Right. Exactly.
To teach a lesson.
Exactly. And the lesson that they're trying to teach here is that, that like blissful utopian that existed hundreds of years prior was lost because they got contaminated by foreign influence. So here's where that convenient, xenophobia pops up. But they believe that it was still possible to like recover those conditions that the ancient Japanese people had through isolation. And as a result, Japan enters a 200-year period of peace, relative peace, and isolation from the rest of the world. And that is, of course, until the gunboats arrive. So in the 17th and 19th centuries, China, kind of jumping around a little bit here, they developed a relatively advanced civilization and didn't really need to import a whole lot of anything, right? As a matter of fact, the opposite was true. The things that they were making were in high demand all over the world, tea, silk, spices, fine china, stuff like that. And the problem was that China didn't want to trade any of the Western junk for their wares. They only wanted silver, which was in great supply. It was in short supply, I should say, in the West. So this caused a bit of a trade deficit that eventually, go figure, led to the Opium Wars between China and the British. And, yada, yada. Next thing you know, the British now own Hong Kong after that war. And what's relevant about that story is that Japan took notice of what happened to China and kind of gave them the spooks about something like that happening to them in the future. It also gave them some preliminary ideas about, potentially being like the big dog in Asia, seeing how China was just utterly humiliated by the Western powers. And at the same time, the shogunate and the feudal system in Japan was generally just collapsing by that point. And the emperor was a puppet to the shogun. A lot of people were worried about fighting Western powers with all their modern weapons, since the current Japanese government had been totally cut off from trade from the West. And they couldn't exactly build up to a Western strength without that trade. So, they were kind of in a pickle. Meanwhile, the U.S. is becoming more and more interested in Japan. This is the period where the U.S. was annexing California, and they had their eyes set on the Pacific, and they were figuring that there would be more and more commerce happening to Asia vis-a-vis, that Pacific coast. And one reason for the U.S. interest in Japan was that, the U.S. had recently converted from wood ships to coal ships, and the U.S. merchant ships would require, more fueling stations across the Pacific to make the journey. Another big reason is that there was a rumor that Japan was actually loaded up with a shit ton of coal, which turned out not to be true. But nevertheless, these were kind of motivating factors that got the U.S. super interested in Japan. So in 1845, there was this resolution put forward through the House to try and open up relations with Japan. And they initially send over Commodore James Biddle to lead an expedition to Japan to open up some trade relations. So Biddle, he sails directly at Edo. And to make a long story short, he gets rejected. In fact, Biddle's voyage to Japan ends up being really, really embarrassing. What makes it an embarrassment was that rather than the expedition just being a failure on its own, was that there was like this awkward miscommunication that happens. Evidently, Biddle jumped on board a Japanese ship thinking they invited him on, but he wasn't. They get into a little bit of a scuffle, and allegedly he's pushed to the floor and has a sword drawn on him, which must have been fucking scary. Also, to make things more embarrassing, when Biddle was leaving Edo, Japan, when they kicked him out, his ships couldn't catch a sail. So they had to tow him out to the ocean by Japanese ships, which is just like super embarrassing for them. And when Biddle returns to the U.S., his reputation takes a huge hit, and the press treats him super poorly, especially since, it turns out while he was in Japan, there was some U.S. prisoners there from a wrecked whaling ship, and he failed to get them released. So the next, U.S. basically they sent Captain James Glynn on a mission to free those prisoners, and Glynn was cautious but respectful, and also super firm. You know, he doesn't make any direct threats to the Japanese, but he makes these vague threats, you know, by lying about the number of ships he has and things like that. And he does end up getting those American prisoners back. And when Glynn returns home, his mission was, you know, lauded as a success. You know, the narrative in the press was that the mission was successful because it was supposedly like more of an aggressive tone, while Biddle's mission was a failure because he was weak, right? Anyway, when Glynn gets back to the U.S., he starts to personally lobby for the U.S. to open up relations with Japan, and also just to take the opportunity to shit on Biddle for a little bit. Poor Biddle. And the press basically echoes those same sentiments. So in short, this combination led to the foundation of what would be the Perry expedition. That's what kind of was going on in the U.S. at the time. So the Perry expedition, their first visit to Japan was between 1852 and 1853. And Perry was, he was put in command by the East India Squadron and tasked with the mission of basically going over to Japan and ending their 200 plus year closed door policy. Perry was a pretty smart dude. He did his homework. He knew what happened to the people that came before him, like, you know, Biddle and Glynn. So he basically, before he left, he demanded extra authority from the U.S. State Department to basically do whatever the fuck he wanted, or whatever the fuck he needed, really, to get the job done, up to and including using military force. And so he rolled up over to Japan with something like 3 warships, 3 supply ships, and 3 support ships, which is more than his predecessors, but certainly not enough to like start a full-scale, you know, sea war with Japan. But he also brought some bargaining chips too, not just weapons. He brought some old weapons that the U.S. wasn't using anymore as a way to bribe the Japanese. So that was an option for him. And to make a somewhat long story short, we have a whole episode on this, but this is the outcome of that. Perry island hopped his way through Japan. He basically threatened violence and invasions for every island that he landed in. And he also fired a bunch of blanks at Edo to get them to bend to his will. Coincidentally, and this is just something that Perry couldn't have foreseen, but definitely worked out to his advantage, the current shogun was sick at the time and died. And he left the shogunate to his weak son. Japan put it to a vote, and the rank and file decided that it wouldn't be a violation of Japanese sovereignty to do a little bit of trading, so they capitulated. But they also decided to fortify Tokyo Bay. And, you know, he told them, Perry tells Japan after that, he's like, hey, I'm going to come back in a year to get this trade started, and I'm coming back with more ships and more men, so don't fuck around. And there was a bit of a fight about like where the U.S. would be able to do trade with Japan, and the argument that Perry said to the Japanese was that he would bring 100 ships to wreck the Japanese if he didn't get his way. That's a lot of ships, and for context, the U.S. didn't even have 100 ships at the time in its entire fleets. For some more modern context, today we only have 490 total ships, and not all of them are blue water or even active. So this was a total bluff, but Perry was kind of a G. You know, his ships and forces were superior, but there would be no way that he could keep up a naval battle against Japan, you know, across the ocean for super long. I think he just had a unique ability to swing his dick around and just, you know,
he was just basically like the white man's coming, and you've seen these ships before. There's going to be a lot more.
Exactly. Right. And it was a good bluff. I mean, it worked because gunboat diplomacy effectively opened up Japan to outside influences, which would lead to a radical restructuring of everything, including its government, its culture, even its national identity, and that's known as the Meiji Restoration. But when talking about the eventual invasion of Manchuria and the eastern origins of World War II, the Perry expedition is really like the event to start with. Because without the gunboat diplomacy of the 1850s, Japan may never have gone through such a radical change and would likely never have had the means with which to form an empire to provoke the Eastern theater of World War II.
And that's kind of like, you know, kind of a loaded paragraph right there, what you said. Like, you know, without the gunboat diplomacy, Japan wouldn't have had means to provoke the Eastern Theater of World War II, because you could say that the United States provoked Japan into World War II.
For sure.
With the going, with working with the Chinese and all the trade embargo stuff. So you could absolutely make the case the other way around, that side was provoked. But we'll get into that as we kind of explore this history, because it's a big part of the war in Germany as well. We got to talk about the Meiji Restoration, and basically the Meiji Restoration was, and we've talked about this a bunch over the years, but it's essentially what happens is that it's an imperial government that is actually, the origins of it is founded by low-ranking samurai who were already disgruntled with the shogunate, and they were disgruntled for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons was that the shogun had proven to fail to prevent the country from being influenced by the foreign barbarians, the white man, and another reason was the shogun sold out Japan to the West. So what they did is that they still needed this centralized figure. If it wasn't the shogun, they still needed to have this kind of central authority, or this moral authority, to make this unified state last. Because before the shogun, before the Tokugawa period, Japan was a bunch of rival clans and warring states, and this was going on perpetually for about a 200-year period. So they diverted their loyalty from the shogun back to the emperor, who at the time was just like completely powerless and had a ceremonial role. And there was this movement called What is Japan? And it was basically an internal mechanism of the government that argued that, Japan was this, perfect place in antiquity. We were talking about before. It was a utopia, and that what contaminated Japan essentially was the foreign influence, which was identical to the arguments that were being made during the 200-year Tokugawa period. But the difference is that the new leaders of this movement, instead of holding onto their isolationist policy, they quickly realized that if they don't modernize, they're going to end up like China. Mm-hmm. And that was a big fear, because China in the 1800s was being carved up like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. When you look at China in the early 20th century, it's not recognizable at all to what modern China is right now. It was a bunch of warlords. It was a bunch of international cities. It was, it wasn't until the modern Chinese government really invented in the early 20th century. This is just kind of like a shell of itself in its ancient glory. And Japan's big fear was being carved up like that. Probably would have been carved up like that.
Very likely.
If they didn't, if they didn't, go through this rapid industrialization process during the Meiji Restoration. And it's pretty remarkable what they did. And it's just going from essentially I think people kind of they underestimate how advanced Japan was at the time before Commodore Perry arrived. Mm-hmm. Like, they make it seem like, oh, this was completely just like a feudal medieval society. It was not a feudal medieval society. It was very much kind of a modern place in the 1800s. But it did lack in things like, modern medical science or modern weapons. Modern science in general, that really comes out of the 17th. It comes out of the West in the 18th and 19th century. But like Japan itself was still like a highly populated country. Mm-hmm. Tokyo, or Edo at the time, I forget when they officially changed the name from Edo to Tokyo, is, that is the largest city in the world by the time Matthew Commodore Perry
They have a sophisticated system of government,
so it's not like they showed up to Afghanistan or something.
Yeah. No.
There's something such in a backwater. Like, it was already a functioning state.
They just needed some toys.
It just, the new policy was really just kind of transforming the political mechanisms internally, and just rapidly industrializing, because most countries went through some type of rapid industrialization process.
Right.
During it just took Japan like a couple of decades rather than
I think it was like
40
century years or something like that. Yeah,
it was about a 40-year period on average. It took it took maybe 60 years. But I mean, there's parts of the Russian Empire that are completely, I mean, not just the Russian Empire, but all over Europe, really, that are way more backwater than Japan was at this time. The Russian Empire jumps to mind because there's literally, serf population, like massive illiterate serf populations and peasant populations that come from it, all over, that are completely disconnected from the Tsarist regime. They're their own little local community. Yeah, I mean, I guess in short, the state gets up to par with the modern West of the time. And what's important to the story is that they get to a point where they're able to really wage war and, fight Western powers.
And with that modernization, Japan starts to engage in its own version of imperialism. I think in Meiji Japan.
What's the zone called? The prosperity, the Eastern Prosperity Zone. What did they call it? Like what their name of their empire was going to be called, or what it was called?
I totally forgot. Fuck, that's going to bother me. It was something like that for sure. It was like the Eastern Economic Prosperity Zone or some shit like that. Why didn't I write that down? No sweat. We'll come back to it. So I was going to say in Meiji Japan, they don't just like gradually engage in imperialism. They basically turn on that faucet like immediately, and they start using the same foreign policy tactics as
the Greater
West.
East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yep, that's
what it was called.
Super long and stupid.
The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yeah, I mean, big goals call for big names, I guess, right?
Well, it's just interesting when you read stuff from the Japanese from the side, like glory to the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, because they really saw themselves as leaders of the Asian countries. Right.
And it's because they saw the power vacuum with basically the collapse of the Chinese system, and as they got carved up. So who else was going to step in? Obviously, it was going to be them. They're not going to let the Koreans or something like that jump up. They're not going to freaking the Philippines aren't going to somehow develop a major Western style government that can create an empire. It was going to either be them or the Russians, and that's how they saw it. And they were like, well, it's going to be us then. That's it. So, like I said, they in Meiji Japan, they don't just decide to gradually dip their toe into imperialism. They just start doing it immediately. And their first target, the first target for Japan is Korea. Korea at the time was considered the dagger point to Japan, primarily because of its proximity across the narrow Tsushima Straits, that made Korea the ideal place to threaten Japan. But so Japan did the exact same thing to Korea that the U.S. did to it. They forced their borders open through gunboat diplomacy. And the Korean backstory of this history is super fascinating, and we do a whole episode on how its monarchic structure. At the time, it was reading like one of the Game of Thrones books. Of course, before all the supernatural shit starts to take off, but. I won't dive too deep into that because the names are super hard to pronounce, and also there's so many characters, but here's a short version. And if you're interested, you can listen to the full episode. So one Korean king, he dies. He doesn't have a male heir. Through the succession rules, some 12-year-old boy named Gojong ends up ascending to the throne. Gojong is obviously too young to rule, so his dad takes over as the regent. Daddy takes up, Korea, and he sets it up to be an isolationist country to protect it from foreign influence. Sounds super similar to Japan. Daddy gets nervous that the in-laws of anyone who his son marries will undermine his power. So, he picks up some orphan girl from a lesser clan and makes her Gojong's bride. That's Queen Min, but she ends up not being as weak as Daddy hoped. Gojong and Min grow up, and Min has been busy plotting to take control, quietly filling government positions with people that were loyal to her. And when Gojong takes control officially, Daddy gets the boot, and Queen Min effectively takes the reins. Korea begins to reverse its isolation policy, which attracts the attention of lots of state actors, especially the newly formed Meiji. And that's the backstory for the Korean history in a nutshell. Definitely recommend that other episode though, because it goes into much greater detail. But that's the playing field that we're on right now. So Meiji Japan sends a letter in 1868 on behalf of their emperor to Korea to open up trade. And initially the Koreans don't play ball. And this pisses off the Japanese, but they just kind of wait around. So a few years later in 1875, they take a page out of Perry's book and they send over a warship. But what's different about this situation is that instead of lying about their naval power and threatening, the coastline by firing some blanks like Perry did, the Japanese straight up destroyed a fort and murdered 35 people on site. Like, they did not hesitate whatsoever. A year later, this forces the Koreans into the Gangwon Treaty, which opened up Korea for trade, but also which notably establishes Korea as an independent state. And, the very first article of the Gangwon Treaty stated that Korea was a free nation, quote, an independent state enjoying the same sovereign rights as does Japan. And that was noteworthy because up until that point, and for centuries leading up to it, Korea was a tributary state to China. So the idea that, now it's suddenly a free state after being subject to gunboat diplomacy by the Japanese, that obviously doesn't sit super well with China. And this is where the politics start to get kind of juicy. So Queen Min gets some advice from a Chinese scholar that Korea ought to use like Japan as an example for reform, and also ally with the Qing dynasty in China to come out on top and kind of play both sides and not be subject to threats from Western powers, especially Russia. And that's pretty much exactly what Min does. She starts her own campaign of reforms, uses Japan as a model, cozies up with the Ming. And initially, this really didn't threaten Japan at all. Japan knew that they weren't, at the time, particularly strong enough to annex Korea outright. And actually, a relatively strong and independent Korea would act as a buffer state, for larger threats like China or Russia. So they actually collaborated with Queen Min to get those reforms done. But this doesn't go over so well, and it triggered a mutiny in 1882 in Korea, which mostly was over unpaid wages, but also, about the foreign policy. And because, frankly, a lot of people were not happy with Min aligning itself so well with the Japanese that just kind of came over one day and murdered a bunch of people, like on site. So lots of Japanese diplomats were killed during that, uprising. And old Daddy, the King Gojong's dad, who got the boot several years earlier, he comes back into the picture, and he's supported by 4,500 Qing soldiers, puts down the mutiny, and reestablishes for a brief period the status quo, which was, Korea is a tributary state to, China, and it's also a closed, it's no foreign intervention. So Japan's not very happy about this, but they basically use this as an opportunity to bide their time and do a massive military buildup. In the meantime, though, they do some clandestine activities to support a coup to undermine Daddy's government, but that gets foiled by Daddy, and he ends up killing more Japanese diplomats. So at this point now, the Japanese are really pissed, and they send warships. And well, long story short, this creates a peace deal that lasts for about 10 years with Korea until this pro-Japanese Korean revolutionary is assassinated in China. which triggers both a Japanese outrage and a peasant uprising in Korea, which is, again, mostly about taxation, but also about some of the foreign policy. So Japan sends its forces to secure the royal palace in Seoul and sets up a pro-Japanese government that expels the Qing. The Qing and Japan have a few small battles over the whole thing, and Japan comes out on top, which basically cements its influence in South Korea. Before, of course, it was South Korea, just the southern areas of Korea. And this was all before any war was declared, and that didn't happen until 1894. So they were already basically making moves and doing what would be tantamount to war anyway. But it's officially the war is officially declared between China and Russia and Japan. So that's the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894. And the next few months saw a full-scale war where the newly modernized Meiji army absolutely spanked the Qing throughout Korea. This included an absolutely embarrassing loss at Pyongyang, which Japan took in a day by surrounding the city. And importantly, for context here, the Japanese immediately moved to cross the border northwards into Manchuria. And that's going to be important for later on. The Japanese crushed a border fortification in 3 hours one night, and then the next afternoon sent the Qing into a full retreat. They created a foothold in Chinese territory and only lost 4 soldiers and 140 wounded, which is just embarrassing for the Qing. It's like they barely lost anything at all. All these wins for Japan came despite the odds of the day. You know, a lot of political commentators and like military strategists were thinking that, you know, that this ought to favor the Qing. I mean, they're on their territory. They, you know, have better supply lines, and Japan's this little fucking island nation. You know, like, yeah, they got a lot of people and they got a newly modern navy, but they just modernized. There's no way that they can fight the Qing. The Qing was also doing some modernization, but clearly it wasn't working. Anyway, as the winter approaches, Japan knew that it literally could not hold up in a war of attrition against China. There's just not, the math didn't make sense. You know, they didn't have the supplies or they didn't even have like winter clothes, I think, which was interesting. They went into this war without planning that part. So they decided to move in closer and threaten Beijing by taking a key Chinese port in Lushenkou, which is later known as Port Arthur, which is located at the extreme southern tip of the Liaodong Peninsula. Now, for the Americans listening, you can think of this as like taking over Delaware to have a foothold to threaten D.C. And for the rest of the listeners out there, I don't know, look at a map or something like that. But it's super close to like Beijing, right? And after the winter, the Qing end up giving up because they're like, oh shit, they have the Liaodong Peninsula, we're fucked. And, you know, they end up ceding the Liaodong Peninsula as well as Taiwan and some other minor islands in the Pacific to Japan. And it basically seems like Japan was on its way to becoming a local hegemon. But there was one more war to fight before they could really take up that title and go on to form a true empire.
Yeah, and I guess their coming out party on the world stage is, really
embarrassing China.
It's embarrassing China, but it was still, to the West, it was considered like, they considered like some foreign yellow nation that was far less advanced, and it was far less advanced than Western countries at the time. The true coming out party when they set themselves on the world stage is really the early 20th century, 1905, 1906, when they defeat Russia in the war, and basically, right. And this kind of piggybacks off the last episode that we did with the Tsar's government. It's an interesting side note. When there was a lot of Western leaders that had kind of really negative experiences in Japan, which, where something didn't go right. Like there's like a famous story about Kaiser Wilhelm going over when he was in Japan. Like the Japanese populace did not take to him, and there was like protests against them, and there's like a lot of like kind of this animosity between Western leaders visiting and Japanese politicians, especially with European countries. At the time, they looked at the English-speaking U.S. and the British a lot more favorable than the Russians and the Germans, it was an interesting dynamic that played out. But I guess what happens with the the Russo-Japanese War is that there's kind of a power vacuum, and the big players were Russia and Japan, and there was this rapid modernization process that was taking place in Russia at basically the same time as this rapid modernization process was taking place in Japan. They same time periods, and basically this was kind of a war over railroad space. So there was so I guess the way the geopolitical sphere was working out was that there was this massive political rivalry between Germany and France, and at the time they were both sort of still competing for favor with Russia to some degree. The British were trying to negotiate spheres of influence in Asia with Russia. And essentially, the British had this big fear that at any time the Russian army could just walk over and take India from their colonies in the east, just because they would never be able to support India with the land army. So they always had this fear over losing the British Raj. Russia really gets involved in Northeastern Asia after the Sino-Japanese War, which leads to these concessions involving the Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula. Peninsula. I can never pronounce that correctly.
Yeah, Liaotung.
The Russo-Chinese Bank was established the next year with basically French capital to finance the construction of a railroad in northern Manchuria. So Russia acquired leases in Port Arthur and throughout the peninsula, and then started building out railroads. Really railroads to Port Arthur. The Boxer Rebellion that...
Yeah, I don't mean to cut you off there, but you're missing a little bit of important context for Japan here, and it's that they won the Sino-Japanese War, and they got the spoils of the entire Liaodong Peninsula, which would include Port Lushenkou, or what would later be called Port Arthur. But the issue there was that the European powers didn't like that Japan took over that area because they had their sights on it as well. And so after that first Sino-Japanese War, Japan was pressured by a bunch of these European powers, especially Russia, to let go of the Liaodong Peninsula. And so there was this basically this triple intervention, what it was called, between Germany, Russia, and France. And they basically got together and told Japan to fuck off in the Liaodong Peninsula. And even though Japan was coming off of a high, they weren't stupid enough to pick a fight with three major Western powers simultaneously. But they were able to, because of this, figure out that the Western plan was to carve up the crumbling Qing Empire, and that they had no plans on letting Japan have any piece of it. So Japan sets up this mutual agreement with the British, who you mentioned, was itself afraid of, losing its possessions in the Asia Pacific, like India and some of their island possessions in the Pacific Ocean. So they create this kind of bond between one another to counteract that triple threat laid out to them by the Germans, the French, and the Russians. British were super happy to help because it strengthened their interest in the region as well against those very same powers.
Yeah, and the British were super. At this time period, the British were they were very isolated. They didn't really have a strong partnership in Europe. They didn't really have any strong partnerships in the world. They still had territorial disputes with the United States, which they which they kind of really kind of get on their knees to the U.S., in the late 1800s. But it was this time where they feel this isolation, and they basically reach out to Japan. They're like, hey, like, do you want to partner up? Both of us are these great island nations. We have a lot in common, and we have a mutual enemy, and that enemy is always Russia for the British, even though it changes right before World War I. But up until like up until the British get into this large naval race with Germany, their primary rival is the Russian Empire, and it's the Russian Empire throughout the entire 19th century. It's the Great Game, which is like the geopolitical struggle over Central Asia. So they reach out to Japan to form this partnership, and it works out for them. They chose wisely in their partnership.
And meanwhile, Korea declares its independence from the Qing, and it starts going through a lot of reforms that were all obviously sponsored by Japan, who had won that Sino-Japanese War. But Russia somehow manages to get a lot of initial benefits in Korea during this modernization process. I mean, the king of Korea even stayed in Russia, in the Russian legation, for like a year. And by this time, under Tsar Nicholas II, Russia had been expanding its empire, from Eastern Europe through the eastern stretches of East Asia. But because of like insufficient modernization and rising debts, I think Russia was pretty weak at this moment, and had a lot of challenges. The construction of that Trans-Siberian Railway was the major project that symbolized Russia's ambitions in the East, but obviously needed to be bankrolled somehow. So they were in debt. They became a debtor nation, and the idea behind this was to connect Western Russia with the East and open up the possibility for expansion into Chinese territory and beyond. And then in 1897, to your point, and this is the point that I cut you off there, Henry, 1897, Russia goes ahead and leases the warm water port, Port Arthur, or Lushunku, whichever one it was called at the time, from China. And that's the same port that Russia told Japan to fuck off from in that triple intervention. Side note, and for obvious reasons, it seems like most of the conflicts Russia gets into in the modern age involves at least one warm water port. I was thinking about this in a funny way, like if Puerto Rico becomes an independent state or like an independent nation from the U.S., like I wouldn't at all be surprised if we saw like a Russian sub showing up in San Juan to ask to park their shit in our marina. That's my World War III prediction.
Yeah, that would be a World War III prediction. But yeah, I mean, it's that is a keen observation. It's always been one of the biggest challenge for Russia has always been finding a warm water port or or getting port access. There's just there's limited real estate for them to take.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they chose the northernmost area, so
and it's like and everyone knows that. So the British were, the British and the French in the 19th century, their geopolitical objectives were always to prevent Russia from getting
just cockblock them,
by the cockblock them any way they could. I mean, that's what the Crimean War was really about. Right. And they
part of the Syrian War also had Russia's interest there was the ports there as well.
In a more of a modern context, but it's really interesting because there is there's this recognition that the big population in Europe, like the country that has the most potential to be like a true superpower, is always Russia. And it's this fear across all these European nations at the time that, Russia is going to be the big power once they get their shit together. They have 180 million people who live within the Russian Empire. Like once they modernize, like they might be the most powerful country in the world. We need to do whatever we can to keep them from reaching this
Getting
industrialization
poor
potential.
Yeah.
And then the French finally are just like, fuck it, let's just invest in it and make some money off of this.
Right. And what they invested in, and to come back to the topic, Russia builds a railway to connect their existing Trans-Siberian Railway to the port of Port Arthur. And that goes straight through the territory in China that Japan was eyeing to take for themselves. Then in 1899, and this is where we get into the Boxer Revolution, which I don't think we've ever done like a full episode or like a detailed, go through on this one. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about that. 1899, and this is fucking crazy, a bunch of literal kung fu fighters in China led an anti-foreign, anti-colonial, and anti-Christian uprising, which is called the Boxer Revolution. And those guys were led by an interestingly named group called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which is just hilarious. And they were known as boxers because they practiced Chinese martial arts like kung fu, which at the time was called Chinese boxing. And these rebels rose in response to foreign influence and privileges that were given to Christian missionaries in China. But the funniest reasons that I learned of why they started this revolution was a series of natural disasters, like the flooding of the Yellow River and like a bunch of droughts that happened, that they end up blaming on the foreign and Christian presence in China. So this was like the 19th century version of the Jewish space lasers conspiracy that like blamed the California wildfires on the Rothschilds. And it's equally stupid. But in this case, that conspiracy led to an armed rebellion that killed a bunch of people, including Christian missionaries and Chinese Christians. And it came to a peak in 1900 when they showed up to Beijing, and they're basically telling people to support Qing and exterminate the foreigners, which is a very scary thing to be saying. And a bunch of foreign diplomats and a bunch of other people affected, like Chinese Christians, sorry. A bunch of foreign diplomats and others, they seek refuge in the diplomatic legation and quarter in Beijing, which the Boxers quickly end up besieging. And I have to cover this part because it's so fucking weird. These nutjobs, the Boxers, they believed that they were somehow immune to bullets.
I forgot a lot of this history, man. Like a lot of this stuff about the Japanese annexation of Korea and the Boxer Rebellion. I can't believe how much I forgot, but I do remember reading about this. That
they really thought they were immune to bullets. So apparently, because these secret societies like the Righteous and Harmonious Fist guys, right?
That's just fucking awesome. That is such a funny name.
Yeah, it really is. But how they would
that
initiate
is funnier than the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yeah, that one's just kind of a corny name, right? It's just like you couldn't think of something more catchy, and you just have.
Yeah, I guess that is kind of it's like it's a blatant empire, and especially in the context of like creating when we did the episode on Unit 731. And they're like making all these labs, and like all these labs are for the glory of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, that is awesome name.
Yeah, Righteous and Harmonious Fist dudes. So they led their new members to believe that they're immune to bullets, and they would tell them that like their kung fu magic or whatever would protect them from foreign weapons like these bullets. And how they would get them to believe this, they would prove it by shooting blanks at their members and be like, see, nothing happened to you. We just shot you with one of these Western bullets, right? And it's just like so fucking crazy because they would believe it. And, this is a great way to get their new members pumped about murdering a bunch of Christians and foreigners by just making them believe that they have superpowers, right? But also, it made it super easy for them to get wrecked when the West got involved because they believed they had fucking kung fu magic or some shit like that. So in response to these righteous fisters,
Righteous fisters?
yeah, that's what I'm calling them.
Righteous fisters.
They an 8-nation alliance was formed, and that was with the Americans. The
Can I cut you off real quick?
Austro-Hungarians.
Righteous
Yeah, go
fisters
ahead.
would be a great name for like for a metal band.
Yeah,
Righteous fisters.
we are like a punk band, maybe. Right? We are the
Yeah,
righteous
a punk
fisters. Yeah. But yeah, so 8-nation alliance formed. It's the Americans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and the Russians, which is kind of an unprecedented, like, you know, commingling of nations for one distinct purpose of you know, preventing these righteous fisters from killing, you know, their diplomats. And these forces intervened and obviously quickly defeated not only the fisters, but also the Chinese Imperial Army that was taking their side. And they lifted the siege in Beijing. And the aftermath of this saw like extensive looting and executions of these fisters, as well as the Boxer Protocol, which imposed severe penalties on China, including the payment of these like large indemnities, which, by the way, exceeded their annual revenues. Like the amount of money that they had to pay exceeded their annual revenues every year. It also allowed foreign troops to station in Beijing, which is, again, just the insult to injury. The Qing dynasty is just totally in full collapse at this point. And, you know, their inability to manage the situation weakened its hold on China.
It's a difficult situation. So you're Sopranos.
Very difficult situation for sure.
It's a difficult situation.
But I mean, this prompted significant governmental reforms in China, which ultimately would prove futile because, you know, the Qing dynasty would collapse pretty soon after. But I'll point out, though, that, and this is kind of important, the Russian involvement in the 8-nation alliance against the fisters was primarily to just secure the railway that they built between Port Arthur and Russia. They didn't really do much of anything outside of just put troops on the railway. And people took notice of that, especially Japan. And once the rebellion was over, they never left. In fact, they actually took the opportunity after that, you know, engagement to send more troops into the area, because now, you know, part of the deal, you know, the capitulation deal with the Chinese was that now they can send troops into Beijing and other areas of China. You know, they really didn't want to take any more risk with their, you know, big expansion projects in China. And this obviously doesn't sit well with the Japanese, you know, who also participated in the 8-nation, you know, collective, but also wanted to take that same territory for themselves. So at a certain juncture, Japan kindly asks Russia to get out, and Russia responds, "I got a better idea. How about you get out of China?" Which, you know, I mean, I'm obviously paraphrasing and trivializing the issue, but that's basically how it went down. You know, Tsar Nicholas II, he was pretty certain that he could beat Japan at this point. And pretty much every major nation thought that would be an easy win. Like if there was betting odds, that it would definitely be stacked towards Russia. I mean, they had 3 times the population and 5 times the military. It was pretty far away, you know, on the western side, of course, but I mean, that's just a small technical issue, right? Well, it wasn't.
And people had experience fighting the Russians.
Right.
Like they knew that the army existed and was good. And honestly, in like the in the early 20th century, the Russian army was really good. The army itself was good. What ends up getting fucked is the Navy. Like the Navy is what gets underclassed.
They also just couldn't move their troops across land yet because the Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't totally finished. So moving troops across that just vast territorial expanse that they have was really a difficult issue. And at this point, Nicholas really, really needed a win because Russia was starting to fracture under like general discontent. and their unwillingness to come to a negotiated settlement with Japan over this like Manchurian area that they were building a railroad through. Like they just straight up didn't want to negotiate at all. And not only did they not want to negotiate, but they pushed the envelope even further and was like, "Oh, how about you just leave Korea instead?" You know, like they were trying to be a bully about it, you know? And this fucked them, you know, because Japan declares war in February of 1904. And in just a couple of hours after declaring war, they attack Port Arthur and crush the Russian Pacific Fleet, like absolutely cripple it. And they take this opportunity to start pouring their army into Korea. The Russians end up setting fortifications on their side of the border in China, but the Japanese numbers and their crazy will, and I can't underscore this enough, these guys would fight to the death. They would never surrender. They just do fucking insane things. And that had a lot to do with the culture surrounding the militarized culture that came up around the Meiji Restoration, right? Like militarism was instilled in their like educations from a very early age. And, they just made a bunch of insane fucking kamikaze, attackers. And this scared the shit out of Russians because like the Russian army was fantastic at the time, like you pointed out, but like they also weren't like, they didn't have like a death wish, right? That's not how they fought. And so that scared them off, from the border. They pushed back. They surrendered Port Arthur pretty quickly. And now Russia has a problem.
And it's so far from Russia too. It's like
exactly
the reason why this leads to the turmoil from the Sino-Japanese, from the Russo-Japanese War. Kind of is like the beginning of the end for the Tsar, like we had mentioned. But one of the reasons why it's such a catastrophe is because at home there's so many economic and political problems in Russia at the time.
Right.
And there's this kind of culminates into Bloody Sunday where the Tsar's police fire on a labor protest, which leads to a mass civil unrest for I think about a 3-week period of just horrible civil unrest, people assassinated on a regular basis, like just really bad. But one of the reasons why it was so crazy is because there's all these political economic problems at home, and then you're fighting this stupid war in fucking, we don't even know where China. The hell this is. Like where exactly. Like where is this? Where like we don't port, like what is this Port Arthur?
Why exactly are we fighting?
There was no like strings attached or national pride associated with this for the average Russian or a Russian national movement. In Japan, it's in their backyard. So just the morale was just so much higher.
And the thing about that was that like the Tsar would have done, like hindsight being 2020. If he was smart, he would have tried to do a negotiated settlement with Japan about the Chinese like territories. Like if he was smart. But because of his pride and because of the weak position that he was in, he needed to try and swing his dick around a little bit to try and get a win. To make him look stronger. So his pride got in the way. And maybe if they would have done a negotiated settlement before, like, hey, okay, we're still building this railroad. We still want Port Arthur because we need it. But like, you can have all of this other area, right? I think that probably would have worked out. Maybe not in the super long term, but definitely in the short term. And what that would have done was given Russia the opportunity to complete a lot of those projects that they were working on, like the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which would have given them a lot better position to take on the Japanese later on down the line, because it would have given them a land corridor to move more troops, which, they were fantastic troops, So that would have really given some problems to the Japanese. But instead, they wanted to, be kind of a bully about it and underestimate the Japanese and their, modernization process. And now they're getting their fucking shit spanked. And like I said, they lost Port Arthur. They lost the majority of their Pacific Fleet in a couple hours after declaring war, which is just crazy. And Russia's got a big problem. that railroad is incomplete. So getting like ground support by rail would take a while. Now they do it, right? They send over the troops as far as they can get through the Russian territory. And then the rest of it, they have to basically march. And all of their other ships that they could possibly use were on another continent in Europe, right? And there isn't exactly like a direct route to China by ship, right? You have to go a fucking long meandering path around.
You have to go across the Cape of South Africa. That's how they were getting
Well,
there.
you could go through the Suez Canal, but there's that's kind of an important point that we'll talk about in a second here.
Well,
basically
all the Suez Canal is the Brits shut it down, so they were forced to go.
There's a reason why the Brits shut it down too. So we'll get into that. But so anyway, they decide, all right, we're going to do both. We're going to go ahead and send, our soldiers on as far as we can, with the railway, and they'll march the rest of the way. And then we're also going to send their mostly under-trained Baltic fleet to Japan. And before this fleet even gets out to the Atlantic Ocean, they open fire on some British merchant ships, mistaking them for Japanese ships, which by itself is fucking ridiculous. Like, why the fuck would the Japanese be already way over there, right? Just makes no sense whatsoever. And this obviously pisses off the Brits. So the Brits shut down the Suez Canal. And that's the reason why they can't go through the Suez Canal, right? Also, there were some concerns about the size of the ships in the fleet might not have been able to pass through the Suez Canal too. So that plan wasn't probably going to work anyway, but they really fucked themselves by pissing the Brits off. And a lot of the ports along the way, in European countries weren't letting them dock and refuel and, whatever, because they wanted to be neutral. They were like, oh shit, these Japanese are actually kind of, doing some shit. Did you hear that they crushed the Pacific Fleet in a couple hours? They were thinking I don't want to piss off the Japanese right now because they might come out on top at this point. And so they send this Baltic fleet the fucking long way to the Pacific, which is going all the way the fuck around Africa and the Cape of Africa, which is a long, long trip. It takes them 7 months just to get to Madagascar. 7 months. And by then, the sailors were becoming mutinous. And to make matters worse, the Baltic fleet didn't have enough coal by the time they got to the Pacific to sail the long way around Japan, to go around them to get to Vladivostok. Sorry, that one's hard. Which is the easternmost port in Russia, the cold water port that's close to Japan. So they end up having to take the route through the Tsushima Straits that goes between Japan and Korea. And the thing to remember here is that Japan had literal months to prepare for this Baltic fleet to make its way through the Tsushima Straits. And Tojo, the admiral, the guy that was in charge of the armies there, he knew what the deal was, right? He understood that they would have to go the long way. He understood that it would take them months, which is why he took that opportunity to basically refit his ships and get ready for a potential naval battle. He also knew that they probably weren't going to get any support from, other countries to refuel and rearm along the way because, there's a lot of chatter. They just dealt a devastating blow in a couple hours, and that news got around to the world pretty quickly. So he laid a trap. He was like, yep, I know that they're going to have to go through the Tsushima Straits. And they started using a wireless telegraph to do communications. And there was a bit of a fog that happened, but they were able to track the Baltic fleet. And, basically what happens was fucking crazy. Russia fucked around and found out pretty quickly. They took that route through the Tsushima Straits, and the modern fast-firing Japanese naval ships dominated the Russians and their ships with just more advanced technology and superior speed. They use these tactical maneuvers to sink much larger battleships. One such battleship, the Borodino, was destroyed when it took a direct hit, and they only had one survivor out of the 855 on board. And by that night, the desperate Russians, they They were hoping that the cover of darkness would let them like escape and retreat. But the Japanese laid chase on them. And, by the next morning, the Japanese located, what was left of the Russian fleet and kept, hitting them. Russians raised their, flags of surrender, which brought that battle to close before the noon the next day. So it took them a day to crush the second wave of fleets. And the losses were significant for the Russians. 21 ships sunk, 7 captured, and 5,045 people died in a day. In contrast, Japan's forces only lost 117 sailors and 3 torpedo boats. So very, very lopsided, But yeah.
Yeah, it's no wonder that the Bolsheviks targeted the Navy to spread their literature too, because there was so much miscontent, within the naval ranks, and there's like the famous stories of the mutinous Russian sailors, kind of coasting along the Black Sea and stuff, and
I heard some really interesting stories about some of like that one Baltic fleet, about how maybe they were like firing on each other along the way, and apparently they were fucking around like in the Southeast Asian islands, and one of them ended up buying like exotic pets, like a snake that evidently didn't let the ship near the steering wheel.
Wait,
I wasn't super sure about how true some of those stories were, so I decided not to like.
Well, the famous one is Potemkin, is the famous mutiny that takes place, and they were in the Black Sea fleet, and basically they were like going from like port to port, and like meeting with like other sailors and like other labor unions that were protesting, and like that's like the famous one, Potemkin. I don't know the full story on it, but in Russia, like back in St. Petersburg, people were upset about the fighting, and this leads to the 1905 revolt. And to address the revolt, the Tsar had to divert forces away from China and then back to the West. So the Tsar's last hope in the war against Japan was his Third Fleet. But even they were like, no, we're done. This is over. And then there was a mutiny there. So things were looking pretty bleak. The war ends in September of 1905 with the Treaty of Portsmouth, and Teddy Roosevelt actually wins a Nobel Peace Prize for this, for negotiating this.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was one of the lead negotiators, or allegedly was one of the lead negotiators. Who knows how much was press or how much was real statesmanship there.
Bully for him.
But Russia basically recognized Japan's growing influence. They eventually hand over Port Arthur and some of those islands under dispute as well, with the Sakhalin Islands. The Sakhalin Islands in the north, the ones that I guess they were fighting over during World War II. And the world was completely shocked, because this Asian power, and I mean this is the 19th century, or the early 20th century, excuse me. But same goes for the late 19th century, early 20th century. People were very racist back then, believe it or not. This is going to surprise you. I want you to sit down for a second. People were very racist back then. They were like, what? Like, it was the yellow man for these European countries. And people were more racist in this time period, probably in any time period in human history, I would imagine. This is kind of like the apex of racism. Mainly because it's combined with the state and state powers. But I guess you could say, no, that goes back to slavery, which is a fair argument. But this is, part of that.
This is definitely peak racism for sure.
Yeah.
Among the other peaks, yeah.
But I would imagine, I was thinking about this earlier today, and I don't think back in the day before, I guess really the growth of state power, there wasn't. I would imagine that identity was more focused on religion than nation. So they were Christians or Muslims rather than
right. There was the concept of race, but I definitely think because it wasn't institutionalized among like just straight up like wars for race wars, basically like real race wars. There wasn't there was still plenty of racism, but it wasn't quite as institutionalized as it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Well, the other thing is though is that people just didn't have any exposure to other races.
That's right.
So it's like
hard to be racist against something you don't know exists.
Yeah, like I would imagine that 99% of the human population in the early 1700s or the 1600s has never seen an Asian person before.
In Europe, that is.
Or an Eastern Asian person. And vice versa. I would imagine, the same goes that someone in Japan had never seen a white man.
Right.
But where was I getting off? So yeah, I guess the Japanese weren't too thrilled. They felt that they deserved more effort for their sacrifice, but the top brass, and that when I say that I mean in terms of the surrender, they felt like they should have got more accommodation. So the Japanese public was unpopular about the terms of the surrender or the terms of the peace settlement, and the top brass in Japan brushed it off and used the war's momentum to essentially annex Korea in 1910, and set their sights on Manchuria and China. And back in Russia, the revolution simmered down, but they had the Tsarist regime had to make some serious political and economic concessions to do that. But really, everyone was kind of realizing that something was going to happen to this regime, that it was kind of on its last legs and it wasn't going to be sustainable. And it seemed like the Russian, the Tsarist regime was really doing everything it could to kind of make that system collapse sooner than it did. And, the worst possible outcome essentially happens with the Bolsheviks taking power, but that's for another episode. But that's all really. Is there anything else that you want to add to this?
No, I mean, we could keep going, but I think it might make better sense if we include the next kind of bits in another episode. So I think this was really good, laying the groundwork of the conditions that got us to the early 20th century for Japan, because a lot of that backstory is important because it sets the tone for what happens next. And I think what we can talk about in future episodes would be, to kind of discuss, all right, how did the rise of Imperial Japan happen? Because at this point, they're cemented, like they are the big dog in the area. They're a regional hegemon. How did they start acquiring their colonial possessions? I'd like to talk a little bit about Japan during World War I, because I find that very interesting. How they got a bunch of German possessions, how they did the Siberian intervention. And then we can talk about like the immediate post-war period, the Treaty of Japan. We can talk about, their participation in the League of Nations and kind of the racial equality bits, or inequality, I should say. And we can talk about things like Chinese nationalism, the threat of communism for Japan, and of course the Japanese domestic political situation. And, we can talk about all that stuff.
Yeah, also the concept of fanatical nationalism, which is the term that's meant to describe the Japanese political situation at this period. Basically, it's it's like the perfect storm of nationalism hits Japan because you have these different pillars. One of them is just like the straight up resentment of feeling shafted from the West and being basically locked out of the imperial game. They're like, it's the 20th century. No civilized nation has colonies anymore, or annexes of the territory. And they're like, what the fuck? Like, you guys were doing
this 40 years ago.
Like, you guys were doing this forever. Now you're saying that we can't do it. And then there was that racial component as well. You know, there
Right.
was racist immigration laws against Asians, that and not just that, but just kind of like, there was like a truly a racial tension that played into Japanese nationalism. And then just the core of it, really, when you look at the Japanese state and what the state the two things that it really was unified by was the military. So there was a mass militarization of society, and then the emperor worship. So the emperor is literally a divine figure who is the embodiment of the Japanese nation, and really, it was used to kind of legitimize the authority of kind of like the ruling elites there. But this perfect storm, sets in motion this hyper nationalism that takes place. And then also there's like the superiority complex they have over their Asian neighbors, where they feel like they're essentially kind of a master race of East Asians. So it's just it's really interesting what takes place there, and it's like it's hard to compare it with any other case of nationalism, because
Right.
it happens that it's a very unique brand of it. And then there's also the competing, there's Chinese nationalism too,
Right.
that's taking place, because there's
And growing
there's also
communism, which is like almost supersedes, nationalism
the
in a certain
resistance,
sense.
the fear of the communism as well. It's all these topics, and I know it may feel like we're jumping around a lot into the different periods of history, but it's really hard to stay on track, because we're looking at this holistically, like kind of a bird's eye view. So we may jump from World War I to the Russian Revolution to the Sino-Japanese War, back to World War I, back to the Japanese, the interwar Japan, back to the Russian Revolution, back to the situation for Jews in Europe, because they're all connected. So I don't know if that's disorienting for people, the way that we're covering this right now, but I feel like it's a useful way for at least us to cover it, to jump from topic to topic, because we're looking at things at a macro level, and how things, the cause and effect of different things and topics, and situation difficult.
That's kind of why we did this episode today, is just to like lay down some backstory, because in order to talk about things like, the Japanese domestic political situation, you have to like go back and think about, the Meiji Restoration, right? And in order to think about stuff like, the League of Nations and racial equality, you have to think about the the Russo-Japanese War, and so bouncing around like that can get kind of, like you said, disorienting. So it was good that we were able to kind of lay out some basic groundworks to talk about some of these Japanese topics.
Yeah, and I forgot so much of the history, to be completely honest, especially with the Boxer Rebellion and the annexation of Korea. I really completely forgot about how the politics of it and how weird they were. For me, the history of World War II in Japan's case kind of starts with the annexation of Manchuria, which we're going to get into. But it's the whole. They don't
just randomly annex. Yeah, exactly. They don't just randomly annex Manchuria. Like, there's a whole story behind it.
What also makes Japan so interesting, I guess it's just so unique. It's such a unique case study, and there's so many weird ass things that are going on in the country itself, like the emergence of these crazy secret societies.
Yep.
And there was I'm going to probably branch off too far, so I think we should probably end this, but it's
okay, sounds good.
But I will end with this. After talking about East Asian history, I kind of want to get Chinese food right now. I have a craving for like an Asian fusion type meal. like hibachi slash like chicken and broccoli. You
Yeah.
know, like the restaurants that do both.
Yep. Maybe I'll do the
That's
same.
what I'm gonna have for dinner. Get some Korean barbecue in
Yeah.
San Juan.
Yeah. All right, man.
All right,
Maybe we
I'm
wrap
sure
this
that
up.
came off cringe to a lot of people, but whatever. I was thinking that midway through the show. It's like, man, I kind of want Chinese food. All right, thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you liked the episode, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify. You can also rate and review the podcast, and then you can join us on Patreon as well. Danny, anything else to add?
No, man.
All right, peace, guys.
Peace.